Yeah, welcome everyone to our Practical Theology Guild at McMaster Divinity College. And my name is Kwang Park. I'm a PhD student at the college, and I'm a facilitator today. And today we are lucky to have Dr. Sebastian Kim from Fuller Theological Seminary. I'm just gonna read a few things about him. Sebastian Changhwan Kim is Academic Dean for the Korean Studies Center and Robert Willie Professor of Renewal in Public Life. Dr. Kim completed PhD at the University of Cambridge, and he joined the Fuller Seminary faculty in 2017, coming from York St. John University in the UK, where he held a chair in the Theology and Public Life in the School of Humanities. And he also taught at the Union Biblical Seminary in India and served as interim director of the Henry Martin Center and Henry Martin Lecturer at the Cambridge Theological Federation. Dr. Kim's scholarship interests include public theology, world Christianity, Asian theologies, and theology and peace building. He wrote several books, and he is a fellow of a Royal Asiatic Society and executive committee member of the Global Network for Public Theology, a member of the Society for the Study of Theology, and former editor of International Journal of Public Theology. Personally, I'm very glad to have Dr. Kim here because he's a Korean theologian and our first Asian guest lecturer. So we thank him for being willing to share with us today. And today we are going to focus on public theology. I think many people here are not familiar with the public theology. So I wonder if you could take time to explain the overview of public theology and your academic journey with us until 1:35 or 1:35 or 1:40. And then the second portion of time will be used for the open question and answer. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Kim here with us today, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your kind invitation, Mr. Park, and also thank you for coming to this session. And I've been asked to share something about public theology, since you may not be that familiar with the public theology. So I will give you some kind of overview of the public theology. And I understand that those who are here in this seminar are interested in practical theology. So it will be nice to have some conversation how we actually engage with each other. I've done some work on the political theology and liberation theology, the relationship between public theology with these two discourses. And also I've done some work on the missiology, but I haven't really done the interaction between the practical theology. So perhaps it will be a good forum for us to discuss, and perhaps we may not have enough time to fully engage in, but we can start the conversation. So can I share my screen? Will
Yep.
it be possible? Yeah, just a moment. Let me see. Can you see the PowerPoint? So I'll use the PowerPoint, so the my lecture is I understand is about 40 minutes or 45 minutes. So the 1/3 of the portion I will use the development of public theology, and then 1/3 is some examples of engage in public theology. And then thirdly, I will discuss the concepts, rationale, and methodology for doing public theology. So within that, I have various different subsections as well. Since, as I said, you may not be familiar with the public theology, I'll give you some brief outline of the concept of public theology, and then we can have some time for discussion together. So first of all, the development of public theology. I would say that there are so many different views, of course, because public theology is a relatively new discourse, but at the same time, it has developed, and quite a significant number of people are engaged in the public theology. So obviously, they all have different perspectives, and we often talk about the public theologies, plural, rather than public theology, since we have various different approaches. But my own working definition is public theology as a critical, reflective, and reasoned engagement of Christian theology in the public sphere by seeking the common good through biblical wisdom for the sake of the kingdom of God in the world. That's my working definition. Basically, what I see is public theology is Christians engage in dialogue with those outside church circles on various issues. It involves urging Christians to participate in the public domain and to converse with the citizens on issues wider than religious matters. So the key word for public theology is public conversation, contributing to the formation of personal decisions and collective policymaking in economic, political, and religious and social realms. Now, when it comes to the public theology, is the kind of initial idea is to start from Martin Marty. Martin Marty started the term public theology or the public church, and raised concern over the decline of faith in the values of civility. He talks about the civility, how best we can engage in the public sphere, and also what do we mean by public church. So he talks about the openness of the three traditions, particularly mainline churches, evangelical churches, and Catholic churches. And basically, he started with criticizing the attitude of totalist, their theocratic approach, and tribalist, exclusive and self-interest approaches, and privatist, individualistic approach. That's the current kind of the contemporary churches, the problem of the contemporary churches. And then he talks about the effort to interpret the life of a people in the light of a transcendent reference. We do have a transcendent truth and reference. How do you translate that? And Christian polity and witness. And also he talks about the reason and affection, which are both grounded in God. So he brings out, want to relate with the reason and affection and the truth claims. And commitment to relate private faith to public order. That's quite an important concept, that we have a private faith, but how do we engage with a public order? So for him, public theology contributes to public discourse out of its own particular revelation and the principles it has developed. So that's the idea. The second person I would like to introduce is John Courtney Murray. He's Jesuit priest and scholar. He was heavily involved in this Second Vatican, and various written various books and articles. Particularly, we hold these truths. That's the most significant book by him. And basically, he argued that democracy is compatible with Catholicism, because at that time, Catholics were struggling whether they should engage in the politics and society economics, or Catholics should focus on the spiritual matters. And I think he was very much tried to bridge this between the two struggles. So basically, he talks about the American consensus is consists of the sovereignty of God over nations, as well as over individual people, and talking about the tradition of natural law, that's the typical of the Catholic theologians, and the principle of consent, and how do we engage with each other. And basically, the key argument of the Curtin Murray is the need of public philosophy. He says that there is a need to be have a public philosophy. That's the public forum that people can engage in with. So both secular and religious people can engage in this concept of public philosophy rather than coming from their own traditional approaches. So the public philosophy is already present in the Declaration of Independence, for example, in the USA case, which is the foundation of American public life. It says that that is very much compatible with the biblical truth, and we must engage in with the public life through this kind of forum. Okay. Okay, so the Murray's argument is very significant for Catholics, but also it lays a kind of groundwork for many of the theologians work within the kind of political and economic era. Okay, so and the third person I would like to introduce is the Leslie Newbegin. You are quite familiar with him, and obviously he has written so many books and articles. But he's also very much interested in the idea of kingdom of God is implemented by actions of compassion, healing, and deliverance. So the kind of ideological commitment to some visions of society and promoting peace and justice. He wanted to see the balance between spirituality and the social action and so on and so forth, and church and society. And so the idea of activating Christian vision is the truth claim of Christian faith is acceptance of our share of responsibility for the life of our city, our nation. So it's very much our faith should be related to the what's happening in society and our nation. So he was very much encouraged Christians to engage in politics because but politics will not solve the world's problems, but it's wrong to conclude that politics are not part of the substance of Christian discipleship. So he's very much promoting this idea of a church engaging with the society. So talking about the justice issue, the dikaiosune is the both spiritual and inward righteousness versus outward and manifest justice in social relations. So he criticized the dichotomy between private and public world. So he is also one of the theologians who promote this bridge between private faith and public life. Okay, so that's the kind of, I mean, I can go on introducing various different scholars and their views, but since we have a limited time, I can just highlight three key theologians in this discussion. Now, the idea of public theology was promoted by the individual scholars mainly in the North America and Europe, but about 20 years ago, the global network for public theology was formulated, and is originally founded in 2007, and that was the kind of initial collective gathering of scholars for the course of public theology. So at the moment, we've got about 45, 50 institutions and centers around the world, mainly based in the universities and also seminaries. They formed this global network, and we meet kind of regularly, at least once 3 years. Triennial conference is the global network gathering, and then in between we have various different gatherings, regional gatherings. So if you are interested in, you may just check the GMPT website, and you will see the various different activities there. And then we have International Journal of Public Theology. That's again is the academic forum, is the quarterly publication. So through this the academics are engaged in is very encouraging to see various different submissions and very active submissions. So we are very encouraged to see the development of public theology through this forum. And I am no longer general editor, but I have been involved in from the start. Okay, so that's the brief introduction of the kind of brief history of the development of public theology. Just for the kind of refreshment of our ideas, what the public theology is trying to do, or in kind of public theology in action, I would say there are some examples. So I'll just briefly show you, because you know these events quite well. So for example, just world theory, that's the Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas. They are theologians, but they developed this just world theory. And this idea has been applied to the almost every countries when they are engaged in war or in the kind of conflict between states and so on. This has been a tremendous tool to see the ethics of the war. And then anti-slavery movements, England, we do know that William Wilberforce quite well, but Thomas Clarkson, who is on his right, he was the scholar, and he actually promoted all this kind of campaign for the anti-slavery movement. He produced pamphlets like this, and to really present it to the public through his research and his publications, to really promote the problem of promote the anti-slavery movement. And eventually the UK Parliament passed a law. So is the group of Anglican evangelicals worked toward this. And then the idea of Imago Dei was very much important concept for these anti-slavery movements. Of course, in the USA, you have these Quakers and other Christians also involved in the anti-slavery movement. And Kairos documents, you are quite familiar with that, South Africa. The important document, 156, the church leaders gathered together and proclaimed the Kairos document, and talking about the Kairos, and criticizing the church church theology and state theology, and promote prophetic theology. This was the instrumental for the change of government and change of setting there. And again, in South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the key person to develop it and to really introduce the idea of reconciliation. Of course, there are some criticisms about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but still, it has made a tremendous contribution to peaceful transition of the power in South Africa. And then Minjung movement, South Korea. As you may know, that the South Korean government struggled during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and this problem of the economic growth and the exploitation of the workers, and then also the North and South Korea, and then the military-backed government also used their power to misuse and also they violate the human rights and so on. So there are lots of struggle went on 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the Minjung theologians as well as Minjung artists were actually involved in these political issues and public issues. They brought this idea of injustice into the church and society. So that's a very, very strong, powerful movement there. And then finally, Make Poverty History campaign. You may not be familiar with this campaign. It was in the UK. There was a Jubilee 2000 campaign. That's the Christian concept, but they brought into this idea of Jubilee to basically try to release the debt issue of the debt problem of the African continent, many of the poorer nations in Africa. So they made a campaign so they gathered a number of times, various years, and finally the Edinburgh in 2005, 250,000 people gathered together and demonstrate and present this to the world leaders. So that was a very powerful instrumental work toward the social justice and economic justice. So that's just some of the examples. I mean, you will find so many different examples, and it's more recently as well. But I just would like to give you some ideas of what do we mean by public theology. Basically, public theology is dealing with in the policy makings and also politics and society and economics. So I'm going to expand a little bit more about what do we mean by public theology. Thirdly is the methodological issues for doing public theology. Now, you are familiar with the critical theory. I would say that the public theology and perhaps the political theology and liberation theology, we share this kind of basic understanding of critical theory coming from the Frankfurt School. And basically, critical theory has three emphases, is the interdisciplinary approach and reflective, self-aware, and then critical. So the task of theory is practical and not theoretical, not just correct understanding, but to concrete social and political conditions more conductive to a human flourishing. So basically, the academic work should have aims. One is diagnostic, and second is remedial. So not just to determine what is wrong with the contemporary society, but by identifying progressive aspects and tendencies within it. So transform society for the better. So radical transformation of society. So with that kind of understanding, first of all, public theology, in terms of the methodology, public theology as the church expanding or creating the public sphere. So the concept of public sphere is quite important for public theology. Now, there are a number of people who try to define the idea of public sphere. The first one is the Jürgen Habermas, and I think you are familiar with Habermas, the public concept of public sphere as the realm of open forum in the situation where state and market economy dominate the daily lives of modern Western society. So he talks about the idea of public sphere created by some of the bourgeois, the kind of gathering of the people in the marketplace. So his initial theoretical framework was based on the emerging male bourgeois societies. But the importance of his idea is that public sphere is characterized as upholding the principles of universal access and critical inquiry. So he has presented a number of ideas of public sphere, which is very influential to many sections of the academic studies. So the key issues for the establishment of the public sphere is the principle of universal access and also open debate. Now, there has been also quite a number of critique on the Jürgen Habermas. I wouldn't have a time to go through the details, but person like Nancy Fraser, coming from the feminist perspective, she criticized on the Habermas ideas of the public sphere. Basically, the Nancy Fraser says that the Habermas says that the public sphere as a given and also is kind of neutral, but she says that the public sphere is always fluid, and you do need to see the various different forms of public sphere. And particularly, she talks about weak public, saying that people may have some ideas, but you need to create a strong public to really actually change and transform the society for justice. And then the third person I would like to introduce is Charles Taylor, and I think you are familiar with his writings, so I wouldn't want to go into the details. But Charles Taylor is one of the key persons also developing and talking about secular sphere, public sphere. So for public sphere, according to Charles Taylor, is the common space in which the members of society are deemed to meet through a variety of media to discuss matters of common interest, forming a common mind. So this is the principle of intercommunicating. So central feature of modern society is mutation of the social imaginary, crucial to the development of modern society. So freedom is central to the rights society exists to defend. So he's talking about the freedom and the engagement here. So that's a quite important concept that we can draw from Charles Taylor. So out of this, there are various different public theologians sees the various different bodies within the public sphere to form the public opinions and public policies and so on. So Mark Stackhouse House of Princeton talk about religious, political, academic, and economic spheres or bodies. And you can say the spheres. Those are kind of 4 spheres. And then Durkee Smith of Princeton, again, political sphere, economic sphere, civil society, and public opinion as the 4 major bodies. And then Alison Elliott talked about institutional public, constructed public, and personal public. Whereas I see that there are 6 different bodies within the public sphere. They compete each other, and sometimes they work together, but sometimes they work against each other. And so there are kind of tensions as well as cooperations between these 6 bodies. So this is just a brief idea of these 6 bodies. So state, market, media, usually in the modern society, they are the most powerful bodies. State, of course, and then market, economic, and various economic activities and so on. And then also media, recently the social media, they are the kind of forming opinions and leading the public sphere, whereas religious communities, academics, and civil societies, they are all engaged in public sphere, but they have less influence. So what public theology is trying to do is that working with the academics and then working with the religious communities, for us, the church, and then working with a civil society to contribute to the public sphere, to engaging in the public sphere. That's the kind of a strategic aim for the public theology. So the second topic is the church's engagement in the public sphere, or rationale for doing public theology. Why do you need to do, and so on. Perhaps some of you may think that, well, that's obvious. You've got to engage in public sphere. While some of you may think that, no, we shouldn't. The church's role shouldn't engage in the public sphere. Now, there are some theologians I would like to introduce. The Jürgen Moltmann, the God for a Secular Society, the Public Relevance of Theology. I think he has made a tremendous contribution, particularly in the first introductory chapter, talking about theology must publicly maintain the universal concerns of God's coming kingdom, because there is no Christian identity without public relevance, and no public relevance without theology's Christian identity. Talking about Christian identity and public relevance is that's the key. You can't separate that. So that as the theology of God's kingdom, theology has to be public theology in the mode of public, critical, and prophetic complaint to God, and public, critical, and prophetic hope in God. That's the Jürgen Moltmann's words, and very powerful rationale there. Okay, and then the second person I would like to introduce is the Edward Skillibics, Dutch and Belgian theologian. He was very much influenced by the critical theory of Frankfurt School, and talking about the theory and action should come together to enhance the transformation of society, and the two should mutually inform each other. Nowadays, we are quite, we understand very well, partly because of the influence of liberation and political theologies. But when Edward Skillibics talked about this, relatively is a new idea. So a purely theoretical and philosophical hermeneutics is untenable, because understanding can be severely frustrated by social and political structures. So he talks about social and political structures, importance of that. Okay, and then he talks about the various different ideas. So theology as the critical self-consciousness of Christian praxis in the world and the church is very much embedded in his theology. So the public theology was very much influenced by those ideas. And then thirdly is the Rowan Williams. Again, as you know, that as an Archbishop of Canterbury, and also is a theologian, very much talks about the public engagement and public visibility, public control, and talking about in interactive pluralism. That's one of the important argument for him. So the acknowledgement of the potential contributions of religious communities. So the religious communities should and be able to contribute to the public discussions, and he was very much promoting this public engagement, even when it comes to the public law and public principles and so on. And so once he gave a lecture on the Sharia law, and he was very much criticized by both conservative and liberal sections of society. But at the same time, he promoted the interactive pluralism, which is quite important. So the obligation on the state to provide this possibility to the public sphere. So the religious communities should also actively engage in that, and then states should not hold the monopoly over the conduct of law and so on in his lecture. So he's promoting religious communities into the public discussion, at the same time states to promote this kind of inclusive understanding or promoting the forum for religious community to engage with the secular society. Okay, so out of these discussions, again, sorry to just glance through this idea. Normally I can give this each section kind of an hour lecture, but just summarizing the public theology is the theology is inherently public. I think that's quite important for the public theologians want to promote, that theology is inherently public. It's not just a private for the Christians only. When you talk about the church, it may be so, but when you talk about the kingdom of God, theology is inherently public. Because of its distinctive perspective, theological findings can and should make an effective contribution to public issues. People often talk about, in secular age, people often talk about the religious dimension. They want to eliminate or not include religious understanding of certain issues. But public theology argues that because of its distinctive perspective, it should and can make contributions. And when it comes to the public, this is my view, does not refer to the place of doing theology, but to the openness of theology for any party to engage in debate. And I think the public doesn't mean public versus private. Public means the openness of theology for engaging in and directly converse with the society. So theologians need to convince the Christian community of the public relevance of theology, and at the same time persuade the general public of the necessity of utilizing theological insight in public discussion. So the key hermeneutics for public theology, I have about 5 here. Public theology as affirming the plurality of the public sphere and the place of theological insights in it. So wanted to see the plurality public sphere, not necessarily just dominated by state and economics and media, but all these, at least 6 bodies can fully engage in. Public theology as challenging any monopoly of the public sphere by a particular public body. Thirdly, public theology as affirming the openness of theology with a view to reforming the public sphere. And then public theology as developing critical self-awareness of Christian praxis in the concrete reality of life. I'm using some of the phrase from the Skillivics there. And public theology as utilizing and applying biblical wisdom to achieve the common good. I didn't really have a time to expand this idea of common good or biblical wisdom, because biblical wisdom is in the sacred text, but it's very much influenced by the secular ideas. So you can bridge between secular and the sacred understanding of the Christian meaning. And then the idea of the common good is also a very important concept for public theology. And then public theology as applying the prophetic concept of justice making and peace building. Again, this is the important concept of not only just justice, but also peacemaking. So how do we balance between these two? Now, finally, I've got about 5 minutes. So I'll just glance through here. The theological discourse in public issues. I have a number of scholars here I can introduce, but I think David Trace is one of the key theologians you may like to refer to. He talks about the 3 publics of theology. That's the academy, church, and society, and then talks about the fundamental theology, systematic theology, and practical theology. So he talks about the public theology relate with the practical theologies. I mean, you may have a different understanding of public theologies, but at least David Tracy talks about public theologies are related primarily to the public of society, more exactly to the concerns of some particular social, political, cultural, or pastoral movement or problematic, which is argued or assumed to possess major religious import. You may like to tease out that further. He's talked about the practical theology as part of the working toward the public. Distinguish fundamental, systematic, and practical theologies. So here in the last one, practical theologies will assume praxis as a proper criterion for the meaning and truth of theology. I think you may have a different understanding of public theology, but at least I would like to introduce Tracy here. And then finally, if you look at the liberation theology, political theology, and public theology, I made some comparisons there. But again, I think I would like to hear from you and your questions. So I'll just skip this. If you are interested in the idea of public theology, I can also introduce you some books for you to refer to. So in conclusion, we have a public theology. The key aims of theological engagement are to challenge any kind of monopoly in public life and seek for a fairer, a more open society by employing advocacy, critical dialogue, and debate. And the attitude of public theology toward the existing system is not to condemn them, but to work within them. In terms of method of engagement, public theology takes a reforming position rather than a revolutionary position. Okay. And then so major issues for public theology are inequality, the privatization or marginalization of religion in public life, socio-political justice, and the dominance of states, market, or media in the public sphere. So theological emphasis are the kingdom of God and God's involvement in human wisdom and systems, and it works with the disciplines of Christian social ethics and political philosophy. That's the main engagement, working partners. Okay. So for conclusion, when it comes to the public significance of public theology, I would say these are the three key engagements of the theology. Critical is the more prophetic approach to the society and pointing out the justice issue and dealing with the injustice and so on. And the reflective is the self-critique on our own self-theologizing. And then reasoned engagement of the Christian theology is quite important, because when we try to engage with the society, we need to have a tool, we need to have a language to communicate. That Charles Taylor talks about reason as a tool for engaging in the secular society. So I think that the reasoned engagement is important. And so the church's public and prophetic responsibility, we are talking about public and prophetic responsibility, it can be same, but at the same time, there are some differences. The church as a public open body of Christ. So church is not the exclusive religious community dealing with our own ideas and theologies, but theology should engage in public and also idea of common good. How do we look for the common good in the context of so various different opinions? And then critical inquiry and open debate. So those are the key tools for engagement. And I think public theology is a relatively new discourse. and it has a quite a long way to go. But still, I think that's quite exciting venture to engage in the society and how theology can be meaningful in the society, particularly the secular society. Okay. So that's just a brief introduction of public theology. I'm sorry that I wouldn't have time to expand details, but I think hopefully I'll give you some kind of outline of what public theology is trying to do, trying to achieve. Again, that's my own perspective. There are so many different views on public theology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's so helpful. Yeah, and then I'd like to hear more, but yeah, sorry for the limited time. So yeah, let's have a 1 or 2 Q&A session. So yeah, if you want to ask, please put your hand up, and then yeah, you can ask Dr. Kim some questions. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Park. Thank you, Dr. Kim. It was very nice to have you here today. I do have a question for you, but I just wanted to pass on greetings from Dr. Daniel on. He was on the call earlier and then had to leave because he had a class. For those of you who don't know him, he's the professor of global Christianity and theology at Gordon College, and he became familiar with our guild because he was an examiner for Greg's dissertation, but also he wanted to say hi, Dr. Kim, because you were his external examiner at the University of Edinburgh. So he wanted just to pass on his greetings to you.
Thank you.
My question for you, Dr. Kim, is as we engage in public theology, what would your encouragement be for aspiring public theologians as to how we do this well, considering sort of how fragile and explosive things seem right now? How do we best engage?
Yes, sure. I mean, that's a really good question. That's I think as a public theologian, and also my colleagues who are engaged in public theology, we do struggle. What's the methodology? How do you really effectively engage with that? So that's the ongoing struggle. So I wouldn't say that kind of a simple answer for that. But when it comes to the real engagement as an academic, I think first and foremost, we can engage with the writings. We can engage with how, because traditional Western theology is basically very much philosophical, heavily philosophical or historical, or engaging with more kind of conceptual ideas. How do we translate those concepts and those values into the real life of injustice and so on? So I think that's I think practical theology has some of the elements that how do we translate those so that ordinary people, or secular people can understand the Christian values, because we do have deep values and we would like to engage with that, not in a sense of arrogance or kind of we know everything, that kind of attitude, but kind of seeking the solution together. So I can't really say it's one method and so on, but for example, ecological issues, public theologians are seriously engaged in ecological issues, and they bring biblical wisdom and biblical kind of traditions, the kind of early fathers and ideas and so on, those kind of theological insight into the discussion, so that secular people can also learn from each other. I think that's the idea. I mean, it is exciting, but it's quite a daunting task.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. And then Dale, and then next is Greg. Yeah, Dale first.
Hi, thank you very, very much, Dr. Kim. Theology in evangelical circles amongst the church members tends to be almost sometimes a bad word. They don't want to do theology, they want relationship. And so it's kind of different, but you still saw it, like, so I think here to Canada with the Freedom Convoy and whatnot, I saw so many churches attached to that. And some of the issues you bring up being like environmental and things like that, that side would see the environmental side as woke or whatnot. They'd use those words. Not that I see it that way. I'm just curious, how do we balance? I think there's an issue when the people don't really understand theology and then get behind a cause versus understanding the theology behind it. So how do we engage the laity to understand proper theological discourse on matters like this?
Yeah, that's again, it's a very important question. And I think the theologians have a responsibility. Of course, we do need to go into the deep into theological discourse. But as I said, theologians is like a doctor that we identify and diagnosis, but also we do cure doctors cure the patients. So I think somehow theologians need to engage in both sides. So the evangelical tradition, which I am part of it, evangelical tradition tend to be separate between secular and secular, sacred and secular realms, and see the politics and the economics and so on is too complicated for the religious people to engage in. But I think we do need to overcome those kind of barriers, and I think we do through our preaching, through our Bible studies, and we do constantly need to engage with that. For example, when I first came to Fuller, when I start to talk about public theology, students are very kind of unfamiliar with that and quite suspicious of the public theology as a liberal theology or kind of different form of liberation theology and so on. But I think quite now it really changed. People talk about justice issues and social political involvement particularly in the USA context. And I'm working on the polarization, the idea of polarization at the moment. And that's really generate very much interest because the polarization can be really destructive. There are some positive, constructive polarization, but polarization is really toxic in our politics and economics and society. So how do we engage with that? How can theology contribute that discussion? That's the issue. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And then Greg, and then Jonathan will be last. Okay, Greg.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kim, for introducing us to public theology. And my previous experiences with Abraham Kuyper in my tradition and Matthew Kamink, who's also at Fuller. And, there is this idea of principled pluralism or interactive pluralism you mentioned, that different religious communities balance each other, and we need that so that no one group becomes hegemonic. So I'm wondering what you think about that, and would it lead to ecumenism and even interfaith conversations?
Yeah, thank you. Again, it's a good question. Yes, I've been working with the Matthew Kamink quite closely, and he's a Reformed theologian as well as also from Dutch background. So, yes, Abraham Kuyper has contributed a great deal, and we do use his idea of sphere sovereignty and so on. Although we may not, some of us may not agree with his view on sphere sovereignty and so on. But at the same time, his idea of the kind of God's sovereignty in the whole area of sphere is quite refreshing and relevant. But when it comes to the religious pluralism and so on, now when Dr. Rowan Williams talked about the interactive pluralism, that pluralism doesn't mean that it's kind of religious pluralism he was talking about. Pluralism in a sense that many of the different bodies engage in the public sphere. That's what he meant. And also I personally, the main concern for the public theology is not necessarily working with religious pluralism. I mean, for the pursuit of the common good, we work together with the various different religious traditions, but not necessarily engage in dialogue of the ideas and the religious differences and so on and so forth. Because I lived in India, so I'm very much familiar with religious pluralism and dialogue. But I would say public theology's main concern is rather than looking at the dialogue and try to work together to search for some of the common or shared ideas. I think in order to achieve the public theology's goal is in order to achieve the common good, we are open to the working together, but not necessarily trying to solve the problem of religious pluralism. I don't know whether I explained to you clearly. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. To Jonathan. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Dr. Kim. I tend to be more of a synthetic thinker and gravitate towards connections rather than distinctions. But I am relatively new to public theology, so I'm kind of trying to categorize it a little bit. Would it be, one thing I'm wondering is, would it be fair to say that under the umbrella of maybe practical theology, you would find pastoral theology, and then sort of as a counterpart, public theology? And then secondary to that, you mentioned a number of spheres like media, academic, ecclesial, church community. Would it be fair to say that pastoral theology on the academic level corresponds to pastoral ministry in the ecclesial context, as public theology would correspond to, say, I lost the word, chaplain, a chaplain in, say, that would work in a public sphere, like a police department or school or something that isn't explicit? Do those seem like accurate categorizations to you? And
yes, I think yes. I mean, very good question. Yes, I mean, I don't mind how the public, I mean, those who are working on the practical theology sees public theology, and just like you said, that they incorporate under the umbrella of practical theology. I have no problem for that, and because public theology has distinctive approaches. Nowadays, in missiology circle, there is a group who is working on public missiology. That's very interesting. So they wanted to combine this idea of public theology with the missiology. That's interesting. And so, I mean, to me, I have no kind of attachment to the public theology as such. I think the kind of importance is the public engagement of theology. So as long as any theologians want to engage in the public sphere, then I think public theology can serve as a catalyst or serve as a resources for that kind of approach. I think best person you may like to engage with is the Elaine Graham. I don't know whether Elaine Graham is the practical theologian, but also public theologian. So she crossed the two boundaries, and very successfully, very well. He's a very respected theologian. He's from the UK. So you may like to refer to that. So I think, yeah, that's an exciting venture. So I've been invited to the missiology circle to present paper on public missiology. How do we work in that? So that's quite the exciting venture. You may like to work on what's the relation between practical theology and public theology. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's our hour is up. So we want to thank you, Dr. Kim, for being here today. And then everybody give your icon or applause to Dr. Kim. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And we have one more session for the Practical Guild this semester on March 22nd, 1 p.m. with Dr. John Swinton, who is a professor of practical theology and pastoral care at the University of Aberdeen. Please mark it in your calendar and join us. And thank you again, Dr. Kim, and everybody for showing us up. I really appreciate it. God bless. Thank you.